My son stood in that courtroom and called me a broke old man in front of everyone. He said I never earned the ranch. He said I didn't deserve to keep it. What he didn't know was the letter sitting in the judge's folder. A letter I wrote 9 years ago, sealed, waiting for exactly this moment. By the time the judge finished reading it out loud, my son couldn't look at me. And neither could his wife. My name is Michael Bennett. I'm 68 years old, and for 42 years I worked a cattle ranch in eastern Colorado that's been in my family since my grandfather homesteaded it. 320 acres of red dirt, good grass, and more sweat than I could ever count. My wife, Carol, and I built a life there. We raised one son, Brandon, in a farmhouse with a wraparound porch and a kitchen that always smelled like coffee and biscuits. People used to say we had it all figured out. Carol taught piano lessons to half the kids in the county. I ran 200 head of cattle and never missed a mortgage payment. Brandon grew up riding horses before he could ride a bike, and for a long time, I was proud of the man he was becoming. He went off to college, studied business, and came back with a wife named Ashley. Sharp, well-dressed, always talking about opportunities and next steps. I liked her fine at first. She had ambition. I respected that. For a few years after the wedding, things felt good. Brandon and Ashley moved into a house in town, only 20 minutes from the ranch. They'd come out on Sundays. Ashley would bring a pie from the bakery she liked, and we'd sit on the porch while the sun went down over the west pasture. Carol would tell stories about Brandon as a boy, and he'd roll his eyes, but he'd smile too. I thought we had something solid. I thought family meant something to all of us the same way. Then Carol got sick. Ovarian cancer, stage 3 by the time they caught it. I won't dwell on those months except to say they were the hardest of my life. Brandon came around less during that time, always some excuse: work, Ashley's schedule, a trip they'd already booked. I told myself he was young, that grief hits people different ways, that he'd come back around once the worst had passed. Carol passed in the spring, 3 days before what would have been our 35th anniversary. At the funeral, Brandon gave a eulogy that made half the church cry. He talked about his mother's laugh, her piano lessons, the way she used to hum while she cooked. It was a beautiful speech. I remember thinking, at least he still has that in him. At least he still loves this family. That's the last time I remember feeling certain about anything with my son. In the months after, something shifted. Small things at first. He started asking questions about the ranch. Not out of grief, but out of arithmetic. What was it worth? What were the mineral rights like? Had I thought about estate planning, as he called it, like I was a stranger managing a portfolio instead of his father managing a home? Ashley started coming to more of our talks, sitting quietly with a legal pad, taking notes I wasn't sure I was allowed to see. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself grief makes people practical in ways that look cold from the outside, but aren't. I wanted so badly to believe that the boy who cried at his mother's funeral was still in there, still mine, still someone I could trust with everything I'd spent my whole life building. But there was a moment, small, easy to miss, that told me otherwise. It was a Sunday dinner about 8 months after Carol died. Brandon and Ashley came out, and over dessert Brandon said, almost casually, like it was nothing, "You know, Dad, once this place is mine, I'm thinking of leasing out the west pasture to that solar company. They offered good money a while back. Once this place is mine, not if. Once." I didn't say anything that night. I just refilled my coffee and let the conversation move on. But I remember sitting alone on the porch after they left, looking out at that same pasture Carol and I used to watch the sun go down over, and feeling something cold settle into my chest. A question I couldn't shake. What exactly did my son think he already owned? After that dinner, I started paying closer attention. Not in a suspicious way, at least. That's what I told myself. Just aware. The way you notice a fence post leaning a little more than it used to. Brandon started visiting more often, but the visits felt different. Less like a son checking on his father, more like a man doing due diligence. He'd walk the property with a notebook, asking about equipment values, about the herd count, about whether I'd talked to a lawyer since Carol passed. Ashley came along more too, always polite, always smiling, but her eyes moved over the house like she was pricing furniture. One afternoon I came in from the barn and found Ashley in my study, standing at the old roll-top desk where I kept my paperwork. She said she was looking for a pen. I believed her, mostly. But when I checked later, the folder with my property deed had been moved. Not stolen, just moved. Like someone had looked through it and put it back slightly wrong. I told myself I was being paranoid. Grief does strange things to a man's mind, makes him suspicious of shadows. But then came the conversation about the barn. Brandon called me one evening, said he'd been looking into things, and thought I should transfer the ranch into his name now, while I was still healthy, so there'd be no complications later. He used the word complications like it was a weather forecast, not his father's mortality. I told him I appreciated the concern, but I wasn't ready to sign anything. I said the ranch would go to him eventually, the way we'd always talked about, but there was no rush. He didn't like that answer. I could hear it in the silence on the phone. A few weeks later, my neighbor Hal mentioned something odd at the feed store. He said Brandon had stopped by, asking about property lines, asking whether Hal knew what my land might be worth if it were subdivided. Subdivided. My grandfather's ranch, carved into house lots. I laughed it off in front of Hal, but driving home, my hands were shaking on the wheel. Then came the perfume. Not literally. I mean the moment that finally made it impossible to keep pretending. Ashley came out one Sunday without Brandon, said he was tied up with work. She sat with me on the porch, and partway through the visit she said, gently, like she was doing me a favor, "Michael, I just want you to know, whatever happens with the ranch, Brandon and I will always take care of you. We'd never just put you somewhere and forget about you. Put me somewhere." I sat with that phrase for a long time after she left. I hadn't said one word about being put anywhere. Nobody had mentioned a nursing home, an assisted living facility, anything like that. She'd said it unprompted, like she was rehearsing a line she'd need later, testing it out on me first to see how I'd react. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every conversation from the past year, the solar lease comment, the folder moved in my study, the calls about complications, the subdivided land, and now this. Whatever happens with the ranch. Not if something happens. Whatever happens. Like it was already decided. Like I was a formality standing between my son and a piece of paper. I thought about Carol, about the letter I'd written years before she got sick. A letter she'd made me promise to write, back when Brandon was still a teenager mouthing off about wanting his share of things he hadn't earned yet. Carol had said, half joking, half serious, "Michael, someday that boy might need reminding of what this family actually stands for. Write it down, just in case." I had written it, sealed it, filed it with our lawyer, Mr. Whitfield, and mostly forgotten about it, the way you forget about a fire extinguisher until the day the kitchen fills with smoke. The next morning, I drove into town and called Mr. Whitfield's office. I told him I needed to review that letter. Make sure it still said what I remembered it saying. Make sure it would hold up if it ever needed to. He asked me why, after all these years, I suddenly wanted to check on it now. I told him the truth. "I think I'm about to need it, Mr. Whitfield had been our family lawyer for 30 years. And he didn't ask many questions when I came in. Just pulled the sealed envelope from the safe deposit box and let me read it again for the first time in nearly a decade. The letter was simple, in my own handwriting, notarized and witnessed. It said that upon my death, or upon my voluntary transfer of the property, the ranch and all associated assets would pass to Brandon Bennett on one condition. That condition being that Brandon demonstrate, through consistent action and not mere words, that he respected his father, cared for him in his later years, and did not attempt to force, pressure, or manipulate the transfer of the property before I was ready to give it. Any attempt at coercion, deception, or elder manipulation, the letter stated, would void his claim entirely and redirect the estate to a trust benefiting local agricultural scholarships in Carol's name. Carol had insisted on that clause. She used to say, "Love doesn't come with a deadline, Michael. If our son can't wait for us to be ready, then he doesn't understand what family means in the first place." Reading it again, sitting in Mr. Whitfield's office, I felt something between relief and heartbreak. Relief that I'd been careful enough, years ago, to protect what mattered. Heartbreak that I was even considering I might need to use it against my own son. I didn't do anything right away. I wanted proof, real proof, not just a bad feeling, before I believed my son capable of what I feared. So I did something I never thought I'd have to do. I started keeping records. I wrote down dates and conversations. I kept the voicemail where Brandon pushed me, twice in 1 week, to just sign the transfer papers, Dad. It'll make things so much simpler. I saved a text from Ashley that read, Once the ranch is officially ours, we can finally start making real plans. Official. Ours. Before anything had been signed, before I had said yes to anything. Then, about 2 months later, I overheard something I wasn't meant to hear. I'd stopped by Brandon and Ashley's house to drop off some tools he'd borrowed, and the front door was unlocked. I let myself in, calling out, and I heard them in the kitchen, mid-conversation, not realizing I was in the house yet. Ashley was saying, if he won't sign it willingly, we go the other route. Guardianship. We say he's not capable of managing the property anymore. Get a doctor to write something up, and the court hands it to us anyway. It just takes longer. And Brandon, my son, said, he's not going to make this easy. He never does. But once it's ours, none of this will matter anymore. I stood in that hallway for what felt like an hour, though it was probably 10 seconds. My own son and his wife, discussing how to have me declared incompetent. Not because it was true. Because it was convenient. I didn't confront them that day. I picked up the tools I'd come to drop off, called out a normal greeting like I'd just walked in, and left 20 minutes later after stilted small talk, my heart pounding the entire time. I drove straight to Mr. Whitfield's office. I told him everything. He listened, quiet and serious, and then he said something I've held on to ever since. Michael, you don't need to react with anger. You need to react with patience. Let them show their hand fully. The letter already protects you. Now we just need to make sure the world sees who they really are, in their own words, at the moment that matters most. I asked him what he meant. He said, if they force this into court, we let them. And we make sure that when they do, everyone in that room hears exactly what kind of people they've become. I went home that night and sat on the porch, alone, the way I had so many nights since Carol passed. I looked out over the pasture and made a decision. I wasn't going to fight my son with anger. I was going to let the truth do the fighting for me, Mr. Whitfield and I built our strategy over the following weeks, quietly, carefully, while Brandon and Ashley moved forward with theirs, entirely unaware that I already knew every step of their plan. First, we made sure the letter was airtight. Whitfield confirmed the notarization was still valid, the witnesses still alive and willing to testify if needed, and the trust language legally sound. Second, we'd documented everything, every text, every voicemail, every date I'd written down after a suspicious conversation. Third, and most important, Whitfield suggested I get a full independent medical and cognitive evaluation, done proactively, on record, before Brandon and Ashley could produce their own doctor with a convenient diagnosis. I went through 2 full days of testing at a clinic in Denver. Memory, reasoning, financial decision-making, everything. The results came back clean. Sharper than average for my age, the doctor said, smiling. I kept that report locked in a drawer, waiting. Meanwhile, life on the surface continued like nothing had changed. Brandon and Ashley kept coming out on Sundays, kept talking about the future, in that same vague, confident language. Ashley mentioned, more than once, how excited she was about finally settling things. She'd redecorated part of their house already, new furniture in what she called the study, though I noticed it looked a lot like a home office set, up for someone managing a ranch's finances. They were already living as though the transfer was inevitable. I played along. I smiled at Sunday dinners. I let Brandon ask his usual questions about equipment and cattle counts. I never let on that I'd heard that conversation in their kitchen, never let on that Whitfield and I were preparing for exactly the fight they were planning to bring to me. About 6 weeks after I overheard them, it happened. I received a certified letter, formal, legal, cold. Brandon was filing a petition in county court, requesting a hearing to review my capacity to manage the Bennett family ranch, alongside a separate civil claim asserting that I had, years earlier, verbally promised him the property outright, and that he had relied on that promise to make life decisions, quitting a job opportunity out of state, investing in equipment, and so on. Decisions he now claimed had left him financially harmed by my refusal to formalize the transfer. It was almost impressive, in a cold way, how thoroughly Ashley had built the narrative. Not just, my father should give me this. Instead, my father promised me this, and his failure to follow through has hurt me financially, and also, by the way, he may no longer be capable of managing it responsibly anyway. Whitfield read the filing and nodded slowly. This is exactly what we expected. And it's exactly what we're ready for. We had 2 months before the court date. I spent them the way I'd spent most of my life, working the ranch, tending the cattle, watching the seasons turn. But every few days, Whitfield and I would meet, refining our response, organizing the evidence, making absolutely certain that when Brandon stood up in that courtroom to call his father incompetent and unreliable, there would be nothing left for him to stand on. The night before the hearing, I sat on the porch one more time. I thought about Carol, about the woman who'd insisted all those years ago on writing that condition into the letter. I thought about how she'd always seen something in Brandon that worried her, some small selfish seed she hoped would never grow. I wished, more than anything, that she'd been wrong. But wishing wasn't going to change what was coming. Tomorrow, my son was going to stand in a courtroom and try to take everything his mother and I had built and call me broken while he did it. I just didn't think even I was fully ready for how far he'd go once he got there. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled, with a single ceiling fan turning slowly overhead. Brandon sat with his lawyer on one side, Ashley right behind him, dressed like she was attending a business meeting rather than suing her own father-in-law. I sat with Mr. Whitfield, my folder of evidence closed on the table in front of me, waiting. Brandon's lawyer opened first, laying out the claim. A verbal promise made years ago, financial reliance. A father whose age and recent widowhood raised legitimate questions about his ongoing capacity to manage a working ranch. It was polished, rehearsed. I could tell Ashley had a hand in every sentence. Then Brandon took the stand, and that's when he stopped being careful. Under questioning, pushed a little by his own lawyer to help the court understand the family dynamic, Brandon said something I don't think he meant to say quite so plainly. He said, "Look, my father is old. He's alone out there. Someone needs to be practical about this, because clearly he isn't anymore." When the judge asked him to clarify what he meant by practical, Brandon, frustrated, said, "I mean, he's had every opportunity to just hand this over like a normal parent, and instead he's dragged his feet for years like the ranch means more to him than his own son does." The judge, a sharp-eyed woman named Judge Alvarez, studied him for a long moment. Then she asked evenly, "Mr. Bennett, do you love your father?" Brandon hesitated. It was only a second, but in a quiet courtroom, a second is a long time. "Of course," he said. But the pause had already answered a different question. Then it was our turn. Whitfield stood and presented the medical evaluation first. Clean, thorough, dated well before the lawsuit, showing without question that I was fully capable, cognitively sharp, entirely competent to manage my own affairs. Brandon's lawyer had nothing to counter it with. Their own concerned expert hadn't even examined me yet. Then Whitfield presented the voicemails, the texts, the pattern of pressure spanning more than a year. Ashley's face changed color reading the transcript of her own words on the screen. If he won't sign it willingly, we go the other route. Guardianship. Finally, Whitfield asked the court's permission to introduce the sealed letter. Judge Alvarez read it herself, in full aloud, for the record. The room went quiet in a way I'll never forget. She read Carol's condition, that the ranch would pass to Brandon, only if he showed genuine respect and care for his father, and that any attempt to coerce or manipulate the transfer would void his claim entirely, redirecting the estate to an agricultural scholarship trust in Carol's name. When she finished reading, she looked up, first at Brandon, then at Ashley, then at me. "Bennett," she said to Brandon, "your father and late mother built a legal safeguard specifically for a situation exactly like this one, years before either of you began this campaign. And in this courtroom today, you've provided this court with more evidence supporting the very concerns that letter anticipated than your father's attorney could have hoped to gather on his own." She ruled swiftly. The civil claim was dismissed entirely. No promise, verbal or otherwise, had been proven, and the pattern of pressure undercut any argument of good faith reliance. The capacity petition was dismissed with something close to reproach in her voice, citing my clean evaluation and Brandon's own testimony as evidence the petition had been filed in bad faith, and per the letter's own terms verified and upheld as valid. The court noted for the record that Brandon's conduct throughout the proceedings constituted exact the kind of coercion the document was designed to guard against. I didn't gloat, I didn't smile. I just sat there, quiet, watching my son finally understand what he'd done. Outside the courthouse, Brandon caught up with me in the parking lot. He looked smaller than he had in years. "Dad," he said, "I didn't think it would go like this." "I know," I said. "That's the problem. I drove home alone that evening, back to the ranch, back to the porch where Carol and I used to watch the sun go down. I don't know if Brandon and I will ever repair what broke in that courtroom. Some doors, once you see clearly what's on the other side of them, are hard to walk back through. But the ranch is still standing. The cattle still graze the west pasture. And somewhere, I like to think, Carol got the ending she always hoped for. Not revenge, exactly, but proof that the things we build with love can't be taken by force, no matter how hard someone tries. Sometimes the most satisfying ending isn't watching someone get destroyed. It's watching them finally receive the bill for everything they broke, and realizing there's no one left willing to pay it for them. That's all for today on Dad Until Dawn. Like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, would you have waited as patiently as Michael did?